Braithwaite was one of the founding members of the Caribbean artist movement in 1966. He is also a distinguished academic and currently a professor of comparative literature at New York University. Braithwaite's academic work extensively explores the cultural underpinning of African identity. As we have already pointed out, that in most of the works by Derek Walcott, we could trace a particular reference to the identity crisis and fundamentally the basic orientation of hybridity, the basic orientation of the post-colonial agenda. All these are addressed in his poetry. So generally, just like the last poem that we have gone through, that is A Far Cry from Africa, where there was a particular addressing had been made, here also we can find that Braithwaite has been incorporated, or Braithwaite has been mentioned, because Braithwaite's post-colonial standpoint and innovations with the concept of national language, you see, quote-unquote national language, it gave inspiration to writers emerging from the Caribbean in the 1970s. So therefore, here you will find that as the title of the poem is Names, and at the same time we can find that it is dealing with the language crisis or the linguistic crisis. That's why Braithwaite has been incorporated and mentioned here by Derek Walcott. So let us go with the text, therefore. As I've already mentioned, that the text has two sections. In the first section, you will find the kind of a description has been made regarding the orientations of horizon, regarding the orientation of a person who is trying to accumulate the language of the colonizer. And then in the second part, in an ironic shaft, different kinds of linguistic orientation has been taken into consideration. Say, for example, the text begins in this particular fashion: my days began as the sea began. So therefore, as I've already mentioned, that in case of Derek Walcott's poetry, if you try to identify his position, his standpoint, his identity, his existence, you will find somehow the hybridized culture or the hybrid orientations are always involved. So therefore, whenever he is stating regarding his own race, regarding his own culture, regarding his own milieu, then ultimately you will identify that these are actually referring to the kind of clash, the kind of tussle, or maybe the kind of conflict that is going on within his mind regarding his two identities, regarding his two racial existences. The first one being that of an African, okay, and the second one, the first one is being associated with his the typical Caribbean setup, and the second one is being associated with the Britisher, okay, because the two selves are there, as we have already discussed in the Far Cry from Africa. So here you will find that the poem actually begins in this particular fashion. It's a kind of an introspection that has been made. He begins, my race began as the sea began. So here also you will find that somehow, so far as the African orientation is concerned, we can find the reference to the sea, the reference to the horizon, the reference to the stars, okay. And also at the same time, there are natural resurgences, the natural reference and allusions have been taken in consideration. He considers, my race began as the sea began. So you cannot identify, you cannot refer to any particular beginning here. He considers my race began as the sea began, because when you think in terms of the horizon, I have already mentioned about the term horizon, okay. I have already pointed out that when I was discussing on A Far Cry from Africa, there was the horizon. In the very next line, you will find the reference to the horizon being made. And the horizon actually points out, I am repeating, it is referring to the particular meeting point, or rather separating point between two places where there is sky and land, sky and water. And at the same time, you can consider that this can be considered as a meeting place or the separating place of the two identities true. So therefore, when it is the matter with the race, you will find certainly that my race began as the sea began, with no nouns, with no horizon. So ultimately, you can identify that you cannot properly add any particular name, you cannot identify, or you cannot properly add any particular, any particular race, literally, any particular noun or any particular name to that race. Now, whatever, you will identify that the term race, it's a quibble. The term race is a punning, because one is referring to the race, that is the culture, and jati bolte ja bojhay ar ki. And the second race is probably referring to the kind of a competition, okay, a kind of a personal trajectory, okay, that has been pointed out. At one point, it is the racial identity, and the second, you will find the personal trajectory being incorporated. So therefore, you will find that just like in the sea, in case of the sea, you cannot find any horizon, you cannot find any proper name, because time to time, it's something eternal, and you cannot provide any particular name to any particular part of the sea, because everything is now, interrelated. Okay, because one particular segmentation of the sea is related with the other segmentation, so you cannot just name them properly. And there is no particular horizon, there is no particular separating point, because as you move, you will find the horizon actually moves far back. So therefore, whenever you will find the poetry actually begins, this poem, that is names actually begins, you will find that no particularization, no compartmentalization, no particular reference to the name, no particular formation of, to some extent, the kind of imprisonment with the help of which one has to be attached or labeled. These are not present here. So therefore, he considers, as you can feel, that it is not referring to, that Walcott is not belonging to any particular race. Either you will consider that yes, it is he is an African, whether it is a Britisher. So fundamentally, with no nouns, with no horizon, just like the sea, my race actually began. But I always tried to, what actually happened. If you think about the colonization of Africa, when you will find certainly that the Britishers actually came and they dominated the native people, the native Africans. And at the same time, they're trying to make them civilized, quote unquote civilized, it's the white man's burden to be specific. And in that particular civilization or civilizing procedure, you will find certainly that one particular tool is the, a kind of socialization or appropriation in the with the help of language. So therefore, it was a very common pattern. It's a very common thing, you see, that when you are trying to learn any particular language, any particular pronunciation or patterns of pronunciation, your tongue is not habituated with that particular language or maybe the pronunciation. Then what happens? To correct your pronunciation, there is often, these are quite common thing, that the linguist or maybe the language teacher, he places some marbles or maybe pebbles under your tongue, and with the help of that, the tongue statue or something like that, you practice to pronounce the new language properly. So that means it is actually indicating towards the process of appropriation. You are appropriating the language, and by extension, you are appropriating the new culture. Okay, so language doesn't simply refer to language. Rather, language is referring to the culture. Language is referring to the typical colonial, say, colonial activities or something. So when it states that my race began as the sea began, with no nouns, with no horizon, with pebbles under my tongue. So therefore, pebbles under your tongue, it is actually signifying that you are trying to appropriate the culture. Okay, the process of appropriation, procedure of appropriation. So you are trying to, get the language of the colonizer and at the same time you are trying to gather the culture of the colonizer. So that particular image is actually referring to this appropriation. With a different fix on the stars, that is very significant, because you see that the stars here, you will find that the star is being considered to be very symbolic here. Why? You will find, as we will go to the through the poem, the last section is also being, last line is referring to the reference of the star. Okay, that means different fix on the stars. So with the help of that language, they are trying to make you see properly and identify properly each and every star, as if it is not on your own. Okay, so you cannot just look at the star from your own quote unquote native point of view. Rather, they are trying to make you, they're trying to make you an appropriated subject. That means a person who can look at the star the way I, that is the colonizer, want you to look at. That means I am trying to change your dimension. I am trying to change your temperament, therefore. So therefore, it is being referred to that the navigational ways of the colonizers, you see, the different fix on stars. By identifying the star properly, they could reach the destination. So therefore, star becomes a very significant and very important symbolic orientation is being oriented here. So that's why my race began as the sea began, with no nouns, with no horizon, with pebbles under my tongue, with a different fix on the stars. Here in this particular note, that is the Worldview edition entry, we find regarding the sea, it has been written that the sea is an integral part of island life and figures strongly in Walcott as well as in the other Caribbean poetry. The discovery of the New World and the advent of colonization also happened via sea. So therefore, sea plays a very important role here. Water is also seen as the genesis of life. Therefore, the sea is a metaphor of genealogy, beginning, arrival, and history. So therefore, it can also allude to the process of colonization, okay, to be specific. And with the reference to the noun, it has been stated that the noun, noun refers to any particular place or object or entity or organism. To name a thing is to have access to it. So therefore, the name is very important. To know it and oftentimes to possess it. Naming them is not only a linguistic act, but is rooted in a matrix of power. So that I was actually telling you. So therefore, you will find that with a different fix on stars, the race actually began. But now, here you will find in the very next stanza, he continues, but now my race is here. In the sad oil of Levantine eyes, in the flags of the Indian fields. So fundamentally, you will find that somehow, but now my race is here. What does it signify? Is it simply referring to the typical African orientation of the poet's psyche? Or rather, it is referring to the particularizations of the colonizers truly? Think about that truly, because I was always thinking, I was always stating that somehow whenever we try to gather, the interpretations regarding the temperament of this man, of this poet, we find certainly that somehow in this poet you can find some affinity to the both selves to some extent. One belonging to the racial, the native African orientation or native African standpoint, and the second is associated with the the typical Britishers. We have already pointed out that. Now, if you think about the colonizers, when they are coming from their native countries, that is England here, and when they are coming to the Caribbean islands, certainly you will feel, as I've already mentioned in my last class, that there was a kind of a resurgence, there is a kind of a reference. In some cases, we find them in the typical colonialist discourses, that they feel alienated. And in some places, there are ample references when they are trying to make the new country as their own. Okay, that means that's why to feel home-like, they're changing the scenario, they're changing the landscape, changing the names, changing the, the topography or something like that. But that's why you will find the term sad being incorporated. You can identify, you can point out that somehow if you consider in terms of the colonizers, you will find that this particular formation of sadness, it is actually pointing towards the sad temperament of the colonizer who cannot get their, the homeland here. Rather, they have to cope up with the situations. They have to change everything. That's why the term sad is very significant here. Here it is being stated that, but now my race is here in this place, in the sad oil of Levantine eyes. Now, what does it mean? The poet is actually referring to olive oil, you see. Okay. The Levantine is the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea, where olive oil is produced in plenty. The poet is depicting the loss for the early Europeans in leaving their own country. The word sad therefore invokes a sense of nostalgia for the homelands left behind to explore and colonize the new world. So therefore, in the sad oil of Levantine eyes, these are actually referring to, the particular reference to Africa, the particular place where these are being produced. But if you think in terms of the temperament, in terms of the mindset of the colonizer, then you will surely identify the typical formations of sadness there. In the flags of the Indian fields, now, as we are very well known about the particular fact, that's what actually happened to the discovery of America and something, you see. Why it has been Indian fields? You will find that the poet is making a twofold reference to the Native Americans, who were the indigenous population of the Caribbean, and to the indentured laborers from India who were brought to work on the islands by the British. Who actually worked there, you can identify. So the flags of the Indian fields, again the references of the Indian orientation being incorporated in terms of the people who actually came there, who were brought to work on the islands by the Britishers from India. So therefore the Indian fields are literally referring to that particular thing. And at the same time, you will find that they are also considered to be the West Indian orientation being incorporated, because the Caribbean sections are being considered as the West Indies, you see. The two Indies, as you can identify, the first one is the East Indies, okay, that is referring to India, where we are residing at this moment. And the second one is being associated with the Caribbean perspective. So therefore, in the flags of the Indian fields, these can refer to things. First, the Indian fields can refer to the West Indian perspectives, the native orientation being incorporated. And the second one can be related to the Indian laborers or the Indian people who are brought from India to these places, to these fields, where they are just putting on the flags of their own racial identity, and at the same time they're working just like slaves. Okay, so that's why the orientation is always being associated with the particular landscaping details. So, but now my race is here in the sad oil of Levantine eyes, in the flags of the Indian fields. Then it shows I began with no memory. I began with no future. So fundamentally, that is very significant, you see, that as we are going through a kind of colonialist discourse, okay, or maybe post-colonial discourse rather, we can identify that the memory and desire, it plays a very big role. I have already mentioned last day, in my last lecture, that somehow one particular process of colonization is to erase the history. They erase the history of the indigenous people, erase the history of the native people, quote unquote. Now, generally, if you think in terms of the term memory, and when this is the particular reference being incorporated, that I began with no memory. So generally, you will identify that the memory is being related with the history. And when it is referring to that I began with no memory, so ultimately you will consider that in this process, certainly, the colonizers has become successful in erasing the history of these people. Okay? Because it is the process of colonization, to be specific, when you are just erasing the history of the native one. And then it is stating that I began with no future. That is always very significant in this particular term. You can identify that the Walcott is actually making a reference to the need to escape the chains of history. He is alluding to the collective amnesia of the pre-colonial past among the natives, as well as the inability to foresee a future that is not caught in the throes of an identity struggle. So when you are struggling, when you are fighting, you cannot envision any positive future in front. And the lack of future is also affirmative, since it implies the movement of the colonized subject outside the narrow trajectory of a Eurocentric progressive view of history. Whenever you are dealing with the future, whenever you will deal with, the future process of writing history, then also you will find that the historiography, as I've already mentioned previously, the historiography will also play a big role in the process of colonization, because ultimately you will find that when the historiography is being oriented, that is the history of writing history, you see, being oriented, there are dominant politics is working, the dominant politics of the colonizer. So therefore, when it is being stated that I began with no memory and I began with no future, so there is no past, no future, there is no history and no possibility of writing the dominant history. So therefore, somehow these will help the poet to some extent cope up with the situation. And then it says that I began with no memory, I began with no future, but I looked for that moment when the mind was huffed by a horizon. That is very significant. It has been stated, as I mentioned, that memory and future both are representing two different selves. But certainly he says that I don't have that particular history, I don't have the possibility of getting the future anymore. But I looked for that moment, but this is my heart actually. But I looked for that moment when the mind was huffed by a horizon. Again, this huffed by horizon generally being incorporating the particular kind of a pool that the colonized subject feels for both the native culture alongside that of the colonizers. So we have already pointed out that in our lecture on A Far Cry from Africa, in the last lecture where we have already discussed about the particular division, the particular reference of the division of the two selves or two part of the psyche of this particular poet, Derek Walcott. Halved by horizon, remember, as I've already mentioned, that the horizon plays a very big role here. Horizon is the meeting place, horizon is the separating place. And when it is being stated that with that particular form of horizon, the mind was halved, you will find that this is referring to the problem of a hybrid, problem of a colonized hybrid. And at the same time, you will find that with that particular reference to that hybridity, you will find that this half is being oriented with the identity crisis. It is the typical alienation impact, typical alienation effect that has been pointed out here. So therefore, he says, I began with no memory, I began with no future, but I looked for that moment when the mind was huffed by a horizon. I'm always searching that what was the moment when my mind was huffed by a horizon. Again, the same orientation continues in the next stanza. It has been pointed out, I have never found that moment. I have never found that moment when the mind was huffed by a horizon. So in the last stanza, You have found that somehow the poet or the speaker says, I am looking for that moment when the mind was up by the horizon. And then again in the next stanza, he is negating that possibility that I have never found that. Okay? I have never found that moment when the mind was up by a horizon. Okay? And then he is actually referring to the different places. He says, for the goldsmith from Benares, the stonecutter from Canton. Generally, here you will find that somehow that the poet is in this particular stanza, he is referring to the inability to locate the beginning of post-colonial identity. So that's why he cannot identify from where it is beginning. Okay, the poem, as you can see, it is making a continuous reference to the inability to trace a beginning and the lack of an ending. Okay, where it begins and where is the end. He cannot locate that properly. Walcott actually implies a post-structural view that moves away from linear progression and is focused on the situation or event in itself. So Walcott is stating that ultimately. Now, if you think about the particular reference to the goldsmith from Benares or stonecutter from Canton, again it will be repeated in the next stanza, obviously. You will find that Benares is a holy city in India. Okay, and Canton is one of the largest cities in the South China. As you can identify that India and China were both conquered by the British, and as such, indigenous goods from these countries were exported. So these are the feeder countries to some extent. So these were exported, the raw materials were exported, the goods were exported from these places and traded in other British colonies alongside the metropole. So therefore, here it has been pointed out, in the process of exploitation, in the process of colonization, one particular monetary gain cannot be negated. And that's why it has been pointed out here. So I have never found that moment when the mind was halved by a horizon. For the goldsmith from Benares, the stonecutter from Canton, as the fish line sinks, the horizon sinks into the memory. So why this particular orientation is being pointed out? You see that the Walcott's frequent use of the word, the horizon, is either a meeting point or maybe a divisive line, as I've already mentioned. Again, there is a reference to horizon. You will find here is the reference to horizon. Again, there is the reference to horizon. Again, in this particular line, he's referring to the horizon. The poet actually refers to the ever-present line that is either the meeting point or the dividing point between two cultures, as you can state or point out. Okay. So as with the movement away from a linear progression from beginning to end, Walcott also desists from looking at the dual heritage of the two cultures as either separation or amalgamation. So the fish line is being referring to again the sinking of the particular possibility of identifying any particular culture. Fish line is referring to that, where you can identify the horizon is in place. So therefore, whether it's the matter with Benares or whether the matter with the Canton, you can identify the same thing is being in our organization, you see. That means you have to state, you will point out probably that it is not simply the position or the problem of this man. It is not simply the condition or maybe the conflict that the person or the speaker is actually facing literally. You will certainly identify this is the same condition of the people in India and also in China, probably, as they pointed out here. But certainly in the present scenario, we know that what is happening, and so fundamentally these are altogether different from that. In the next stanza, the poet says, have we melted into a mirror, leaving our souls behind? Have we melted into a mirror? Now the mirror is very significant. As you can identify that the mirror is always, reflecting your own identity. As the poem is deliberately doing with some identity discourse, it is referring to the kind of, the problem regarding the identity crisis and the typical orientation of alienation, to be specific. Now the term mirror is referring to that particular reflection. He considers, have we melted into a mirror, leaving our souls behind? So that's a kind of a rhetorical question you can identify. Okay, because it says the poet actually implies the process of assimilation, as I've already mentioned about the the consideration of the melting pot and the salad bowl, you see. Because when it is the matter with the melting pot, you will find that the multicultural impact is being originated there. What in a melting pot actually does there? You will find that in a kind of a melting pot, multiple things are being loaded with, and then everything got melted. And with that particular formation of melting, you will find that it can be considered that in a particular place where the different kinds of cultures being placed, these can melt into one. So the question is whether this, to some extent, the multicultural impact is being melted. And then it says, have we melted into a mirror, leaving our souls behind? That's why the poet actually implies the assimilation of one's actual self with the image. The allusion is the inability to locate an authentic self here. As I've already and repeatedly I'm telling you, that this particular inability that he cannot identify from where it had begun, from it is from where or maybe to where it is going to. So fundamentally you will find that this particular melting or maybe the particular orientation of assimilation, everything is referring to the inability to locate an authentic self. Colonization has left the colonized subject as empty husks without any mooring. So therefore, ultimately, do you have found any soul being carried by the colonized self, or rather it has been left behind? So that is the fundamental question. Have we melted into a mirror, leaving our souls behind? So that's the question. So where is our soul? Where is our true identity? Is it completely been melted? Okay, so that is the question, and ultimately we can identify again the same orientation being incorporated, the goldsmith from Benares, the stonecutter from Canton, the bronzesmith from Benin. These are all referring to the different kinds of persons who have been taken. Benares or India is being incorporated. You will identify they have been associated with the goldsmiths. That means there you can get that the people who are very much efficient in the process, in the formations of, just like in the work of goldsmith. If you think in terms of the Chinese Canton, then ultimately you will find there are efficient stone cutters. If you think about Benin, Benin is a place, that it is in the country in South Africa, or West Africa, sorry. Walcott actually addresses the divisive identity of all postcolonial subjects through these lines. And if you think about about Benin, that is in the West Africa, you will find there are the people or maybe the efficient persons who are very much associated with the bronze works or so. Why these have been incorporated here, as I have already mentioned, that probably these are referring to the colonial orientation, where the goldsmiths have been taken from Benares, stonecutters are taken from Canton, bronzesmiths have been taken from Benin, and they have been placed here in this particular, a typical West or maybe England or something. So fundamentally, they are also feeling the same. And again, ultimately, you will identify that these are the places, whether it is Benares or Canton or Benin, where you can identify there is a continuous process of colonization is continuing. So therefore, the people who actually live there, they are also feeling the same. So the double meaning can be incorporated. Either these persons were taken from their own places and being placed in the West, in these countries, and they are facing the kind of, problem, facing the kind of alienation, facing the kind of problems or conflicts regarding the self-oriented problems, or they have been considered, the goldsmiths, stonecutters, and bronzesmiths, they are actually deciding that in their own places. And as they were colonized, so ultimately you will find that they are facing the same problem, what the poet is actually facing. So that's why that particular orientation has been taken, they have been mentioned or pointed out here. Then it is being stated that a sea eagle screams from the rock. And my race began like the osprey with that cry. So again, you can find a particular reference to the visual images of the sea, the reference to sea, the reference to horizon, the reference to the sea image. These are quite common. So Walcott again provide the visual image of the sea, as a stimulus to imagine it as the source of the beginnings. From the sea, the journey actually begins. And here, the particular image is being oriented with a reference to a sea eagle, which is screaming from the rock. And then again, the journey begins. My race began, like the osprey with the cry, osprey the bird, you know. Again, the particular cry was there, the terrible vowel, that I. Literally, you will find that the sound of the osprey is being oriented with the sound I, but fundamentally, in a metaphoric way or maybe in the symbolic way, the terrible vowel I is actually referring to the individualistic orientation, the subjectivity of the colonized individual. Each and every moment they're trying to protect everything. Each and every moment they're trying to, you know, to some extent, the subjective orientation of the colonized individual, they are trying to protest and protect their own culture and something. So the problem again, you cannot just wholeheartedly jump to assimilate the journey or assimilate the language and the culture of the colonizers, because the I was there. The I, when you are thinking in terms of the subjective orientation, you will find certainly that the native orientation or native association that can provide you the power, that can provide you or instigate you into not accepting everything, rather protesting something. So that's why these kinds of problems actually originates in the mind of these people and being represented by Derek Walcott. And that's why such a kind of a crisis is being oriented here. So that's why it says that with that cry, the terrible vowel, that I. Behind us, all the sky folded as history folds over a fish line. Again, the reference to the fish line, and again the reference to the waves, therefore. So, you know, almost in a, it has been stated, behind us, all the sky folded. Now, certainly, here you will find, you know, that certainly that when it is being considered that the sky is folded, it cannot be literal, but rather you will find as the history folds over a fish line. So certainly the folding, okay, it is something symbolic. This particular image of the folded sky and the history being folded, these are referring to the, to some extent, breaking the linear movement. The history is not going in its own pace. History is not moving with its true value or truth value. Rather, it has been folded. It has been changed. So that's why behind us, all the sky is also being folded. That means the sky is referring to the identity, the sea is referring to the identity. Everywhere you will find being the natural images being incorporated in terms of the native speakers. And the term folded is being referred to that when it has been folded, it is not showing you everything properly. So that's why the improper way of representing something, the way history has been changed and transformed. So behind us, all the sky folded as history folds over a fish line, and the foam foreclosed with nothing in our hands. So this nothingness is ultimately the basic orientation of history being incorporated. Nothingness is the association. Certainly, you will find that Walcott seems to see history as nothingness. Walcott's understanding of history is clearly outlined in his essay, as been pointed out here, The Muse of History, where he looks at amnesia as the true history of the New World. It is only when the New World fights the need to respond to the traditions of Europe and treats history as nothing that it emerges out of the conundrum of a colonial past. So ultimately, when the history will be negated, when the history will be considered as nothing, at the same time, or at that particular point, you will find that the particular problem of the colonial past will be, can be, you know, obliterated from the mind of the native people. So therefore, it says, and the foam foreclosed. Again, the image of the sea is being there. The foam is there. It is coming forward, and I could find that nothing was in my hands. Okay, but this stick, except this stick. Okay, and it has been stated that but this stick, to trace our names on the sand. So we are trying to find the names, okay, our names, the names of our native existence on the sand. Okay, so we are trying to identify where we were, what was our true identity, what was our true existence. We are trying to gather the very name which was written there on the sand. But if you consider the impact of sea, impact of time, okay, certainly you will find that when we are trying to, grab the stick and try to trace our names on the sand, we find that the sea actually erased it again. So there is nothing remained to our indifference. So generally the naming of the new world, as you can see, because the title of this particular poem is Names, the naming of the new world by the early colonizers romantically posits the white man as Adam. I'm reading from the particular note entry, and it has been stated that when the names have been provided, we will consider the particular reference to the names in the second section of this particular poem. And it has been stated that the naming of the new world by the early colonizers romantically posits the white man as Adam in paradise, who Christians everything. So the names have been given by him. Walcott has argued elsewhere that the privilege of naming the new world, when you are going to name the new world, it actually eliminates an ethnic past. As I've already discussed in my last lecture, that when you are giving or providing a particular name to anything, certainly you will find that somehow when you are naming something, it means that you are obliterating, or rather you are erasing the earlier name. And name doesn't simply refer to the name alone. Rather, it refers to a particular culture, it refers to a particular ethnicity, it particularly refers to a particular history. So when you are erasing the last name and you are placing the newer one, that means you are deliberately erasing the earlier existence or earlier history, and in that place you are trying to refer to anything new. So that's why the particular privilege of naming the new world, it actually eliminates an ethnic past. It is this eraser. The eraser, as I've already mentioned, it is one of the chief tools in the process of colonization. So it is this eraser that Walcott alludes to in these lines. Okay, naming and renaming are acts that should be regarded with indifference, since they are driven by varied socio-political agendas. Okay, that could be detrimental to individual subjectivity. So if you just focus at the process of naming, process of exploitation, process of, to some extent subjugation by erasing the history, then ultimately, if you just protest them and trying to do anything about them, then ultimately it is negating your individual self. Rather, you have to be indifferent to it, okay, to cope up with the situation, to cope up with the problems that you are facing from. So that is the fundamental focus of the opening or beginning stanza, the first stanza or first part of this particular poem, Names. Okay, so up to this.